All right, welcome class to our week 9 presentation. Sorry about the lateness of it. Did do some research and then life happened and I got it done, but it just took me a little bit longer than I anticipated. So this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the two authors that we're reading this week, which are or that we're discussing this week, which are Kate Chopin and Robert Frost. You might hear a little bit of noise in the background. Just to let you know, my daughter is awake from a nap, so we'll see how she does. But let's go ahead and get started. Um, I think that one of the things that we can do when we're working on a literary analysis is really take a look at the historical context of the things that we read. So when we look at authors like Robert Frost or Kate Chopin, it's important to know the time frame that we're looking at. So in terms of Kate Chopin, I think looking at what the U.S. was like in the 1890s and beyond that, I think that can influence the way that we perceive her work. And we'll talk a little bit about Robert Frost's background and where he lived and that kind of stuff too. So I wanted to start with this idea of the life for men and women in the 1890s. So you have to remember that this is considered the Gilded Age. It's the second industrial revolution, and it really creates a lot of growth in the United States. And wealthy become extremely wealthy. They live lavishly, and industries really grew. So this is after the Civil War, and it's a time when industry and innovation are happening and growing and really making a big impact on the U.S. economy. But the problem that we did see in this time frame were huge disparities between the rich and the poor. So the rich were made very rich, and the poor continued to stay very poor. So that could be a big difference in that time period. So there were things like really opulent homes. This is the Victorian era of home construction. You see these they call painted ladies. I mean, they're huge, beautiful homes that are opulent and grand. So you have people that are very rich and can afford very detailed and ornate home construction. But then you also have things like the shotgun style home of the 1890s. That's the very thin, long home where basically you could shoot the idea of the shotgun home was that you could shoot a shotgun from the front door and the bullet would go straight out to the back door without hitting any obstructions. So there was just doors after doors. So like your living room was in the front, and then the kitchen, and then the bedroom, and that was it. Or you have like tenement housing where this is apartment style housing in large cities. Cities became very populated during this time. We had the Great Migration going on during this time where freed slaves were moving to big cities in order to make a living for themselves. So you have an influx of population and this tenement housing as well. Now, the Civil War Reconstruction happened obviously after the Civil War, so 1865 to about 1877, when funds and help from the government stopped being sent to the South. And you could argue that Reconstruction is continuing to happen today, but for the sake of looking at the way that the government structured Reconstruction and intervened on Reconstruction in 1877. So you have a lot of poverty-stricken in the rural South in the United States, and those people often would find jobs in textiles, and that would include women and children. So this is before any legislation had been done against child labor laws, and you have basically a ruined economy in the South after the Civil War. So innovations such as textile industries and these big industrial complexes were created, and everyone would go to work because they didn't have much money. So even the children would go to work at these places as well. So thinking about all these different areas from farming to industrial living. So it used to be before the Civil War that um, a lot of life was done on a farm, plantations. It was very more agree more along the lines of that farming lifestyle. And then because of the Industrial Revolution, we have an influx of city living, an influx of industrial type of activity. And thinking about it like from the perspective of families in the United States, what was it like to be a husband and a wife when now a wife is sent off to work, or children are even sent off to work? What is the difference there between a farming community and an industrial community? Of course, in farming communities, you also see, especially for poorer families, that the whole family works. So it wasn't too big of a switch in terms of expecting your family to take part in the work. But it was definitely different because you're all going into a factory setting, and that will have a different impact for sure. So, do you think that traditional roles of men and women were fulfilled? Men being the head of the household, women being the head of the children, doing more work at the home and that kind of stuff. Things were homemade, soaps and clothing and all that kind of stuff. Most things were homemade before the Industrial Revolution. How that changes the way we buy and sell. Who had the power during this time period? So think about that era of time when the rich are so much more financially stable than the poor, and how that disparity can affect the way that people lived at that time. Who handled the child care going on at this time? So you have children actually working in factories. Were children allowed to be children at this time? I think that's a big impact, children in terms of the way that they were treated. Really didn't have the childhood that we know of now until later. And were these roles complementary? Did they all fit together, or was there problems within the roles? So we can look at that in terms of when we're looking at literature. So looking at Kate Chopin's time period and how she fits into it, we want to see, like, do traditional male and female roles have something to do with the way she writes? Thinking about the story that we read, and the story of An Hour, and how the main character, Mrs. Mallard, reacts to the idea that her husband has passed away. How does that relate to these traditional male and female roles that were very apparent during this time period? Could there have been times when women felt depressed at this time period? Were they able to express themselves and feel validated? And how are those roles different from 1890s to today? How are women different? How is our society different? And you can view literature in that, looking back and forth between those ideas as well. So a couple things to consider. African American men received the right to vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. The women's suffrage movement, which is the idea of women should have the right to vote and take part in the political realm of our society, was kind of put off with the Civil War, and women didn't actually receive the right to vote until 1920 in the 19th Amendment. So several things had passed before women were allowed to even vote. Other things to consider: property rights laws for married women had not been passed in all states in the United States as far as 1890. So some women were not allowed to own property by that point. Some in different states, ownership of women's property was transferred to their husbands upon marriage, and divorce carried a very big social stigma, and any property during a divorce would revert to the husband. So women's rights in terms of property and ownership really didn't happen unless they were single in most states, or if their husband passed away. So I think that really gives us a different understanding of the story that we read. If we understand that Mrs. Mallard would not have rights to property, to her own money, even if she were working, which in this situation I don't think is true. But even in terms of women that worked in factories that earned a living, they did not have rights to their property if they were married or divorced. So if you were single, you could have rights to your property. For the most part, there's also the idea of fathers being in charge of things like that, and then if they were a widow, they had rights to their property. So it definitely creates a different idea when you look at what it might be to react to a husband passing away. So let's talk more about Kate Chopin herself. So Kate Chopin was born in 1850 and died in 1904. So she was born in St. Louis, Missouri. So all of our Missouri students can understand that she did have a Midwest perspective on things for sure. She lived in the city of St. Louis during the Civil War. That can play a part in the way that she really viewed things, being able to look at both sides of a perspective on different ideas, because St. Louis was, although Missouri was part of the Union in the war, Missouri was a very divided state in terms of some people, like even Chopin's brother was a Confederate soldier, and then there were obviously Union ties as well. So St. Louis in particular was also very divided. She married a cotton trader, Oscar Chopin, in 1870. She gave birth to 5 sons and a daughter, so between 1871 and 1879, so 5 kids in 8 years. And then her husband died of malaria in 1882. So she did publish works before the death of her husband, but her writing career really took off after his death. She published short stories in lots of leading magazines like Harper's and Atlantic Monthly, Vogue, during her marriage. But she was a student. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that she was more well off than most. She wasn't going to be working in factories and that kind of stuff, but she had a little more time on her hands to be able to write, even when she was married and had all these kids. But she definitely had the capacity to learn and grow, and she was an avid reader. Her idol was Guy de Maupassant, which is a famous French writer, and then she also studied Charles Darwin. Think of the time period, Charles Darwin, and we also have Mary Wilkins Freeman and Sarah Orne Jewett. So she was reading female writers, she was reading male writers, and having a definite education in terms of that. She did publish before her husband died, but most of her publications happened afterwards. She actually published hundreds of poems and a couple of novels as well. So when Kate and Oscar Chopin were married, they traveled throughout the U.S. and Europe on their honeymoon, did kind of a tour all the way into New York and then over in Europe. So this idea of being able to be well-traveled, she's well-read, she had a very progressive worldview and a social conscience. She used her literature to bring forward things like women's issues, but not only that, racial disparity and social inequality. So the story that we read for our class has more to do with women's issues, but she has several, like I said, hundreds of short stories and poems that she wrote, and then some novels. So she really does focus a lot on these social issues. So you can think about that in terms of if you're working on your literary analysis and wanted to work on Kate Chopin, you can also look at the social or political aspect of her life. And you could do that with any author, but thinking about how she did focus on these issues and tried to influence the world that she could influence through her writing. So these are just some titles of different important short stories she wrote. Obviously, we had The Story of an Hour Here, The Storm, Desiree's Baby is a very important one, has to do with race. A Pair of Silk Stockings, and you also have, A Respectable Woman. So you have a lot of great titles here you could check out. And then her two novels are At Fault and The Awakening. So if you wanted to do a literary analysis on either of those, that would be very cool. If you really like her short stories, or you could choose a couple of short stories, and that would be really great too. So some themes that she went over, like I had mentioned earlier, women's issues. So you have like motherhood, the inequities of traditional marriage. You could also go into social class structure and things, so class division she talked about in some of her short stories and novels. We also have race distinctions in Southern culture and how she finds that arbitrary. The identity, women's search for a personal identity, or a revolt against social norms and conformity. So these are just different ideas and themes that you might find in her work. So if you're looking at trying to analyze her work through the idea of a theme, here are some ideas to look at. Now, she did not live in St. Louis her entire life. Her and her husband lived in Louisiana. This is the home that they lived in, and it's actually a museum now. So if you ever were down there in Louisiana and wanted to check it out, you're welcome to. So you could see that it's not as opulent as the home that we showed earlier in the slideshow, but it's definitely more well-to-do for sure. It has 2 stories, it's several rooms, so it's definitely not anything to shake a stick at. So let's talk about Robert Frost, who is the other writer that we're reading, or that we're discussing this week, in his poem Out Out. Robert Frost is an iconic American poet. He was born in 1874, so lived during Chopin's lifetime, but was born about 23 years later than Chopin, so that definitely gives us a different perspective. She was alive during the Civil War. He was not. Was immensely popular, even while he lived, and then, of course, now he's very popular as well. So you could definitely see the range and depth of his achievement that he can add. He considered by those qualified to judge to be one of the greatest, if not the very greatest, of modern American poets. And he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize 4 times, which is astronomical, really. He was born in San Francisco, California on March 26 in 1874. His father was a journalist and a politician, and he died when he was 11. And this kind of sparked a different lifestyle for Frost and his family. His mother became a school teacher and moved the family back east to Massachusetts, which they lived there before Frost was born. So they settled in Lawrence, Massachusetts with Frost's paternal grandfather. So this is where family lived, and so they moved back to Massachusetts after the death of his father. In 1892, Frost graduated from high school and attended Dartmouth College for a few months. Frost graduated from high school as valedictorian, co-valedictorian actually, with Eleanor, who happened to be his wife, became his wife later on. And he held a number of jobs over the next 10 years. He went to Harvard as well. He never actually finished college. He did go to several college classes. So in 1894, in the New York Independent, Frost's first poem was published called My Butterfly, and he had 5 poems privately printed as well. He worked as a teacher for a long time and continued to write and publish his poems in magazines. From 1897 to 1899, he studied at Harvard, like I said earlier, but left without receiving a degree. So 2 colleges and no degrees. So in 1895, he married Eleanor, his former schoolmate and co-valedictorian, and they had 6 children. He married Eleanor on December 19th, and their first child was born in September 29th, and a boy named Elliot. And Elliot died from cholera when he was 4, or almost 4. So this is the first of many tragedies that Robert Frost and his family endured, for sure. So then they had 5 more children, another son, Carol, and 4 daughters. Their last born daughter lived only for 3 days. And in 1900, his mother also passed away of cancer. So the following year, lots of tragedy in this household. His grandfather passed away, but he left Robert a $500 a year annuity, which is a good amount of money at that time period, and also the use of his farm in Derry, New Hampshire. So he was given a farm to work for 10 years, and then once that 10 years was up, then Robert would own the farm outright. Now, Robert Frost is really venerated as a natural poet or a farmer poet, and really spends time on the rural aspect of American living. We talked about the Industrial Revolution. He was kind of counter-industrial ideas, but so essentially he didn't work as a farmer for very long. He did work for those 10 years, but the last 5 he actually went back to work as a teacher because of financial issues. And so he sold the farm in 1911, once it actually became in his possession. And with that proceeds, he moved his entire family to England, and which was risky. I mean, he already had an established farm, he already had a job, but felt the need to move. And it was a great move for his family in terms of his literary success, and he really became very well known in England. He published his first collections of poems, A Boy's Will, and then another north of Boston, and he really gained an international fame and reputation. So also, while in England, he met a lot of great literary figures of the time. Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, both are very avid feminist writers of that time period. William Butler Yeats, who said that Frost's poems on The Boy's Will is the best poetry written in America for a long time. So he got a lot of accolades from peers, and some of his best known poems are from these works. So you have Mending the Wall, The Death of a Hired Man, The Woodpile, lots of very well-known poems of Frost. He did return to the U.S. with his family in 1915 and bought another farm in New Hampshire. There his wife suffered a miscarriage, so just another element of just some really hard things that went on. Even though he had all this success, he did have a lot of hard things in his life. He taught at Amherst College, and then in 1924 he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for New Hampshire in May. He received an honorary Doctor of Literature from Middlebury College and Yale University, and then gets a lifetime appointment at the University of Michigan as a fellow in letters. So lots of great things happening, and then lots of tragedy happening. So he had a lot of stress in his life and a lot of personal sorrow. So he had 2 daughters, Leslie and Irma, that wedded unhappily, ended up in divorce, which of course, as we know from before the time, divorces were very looked down upon in one respect, but also didn't leave the wife in a lot of ease, for sure. Irma was at one point committed to a mental hospital, as Frost's sister had years before, and then their daughter Marjorie is hospitalized in December from suffering from several different diseases, and she died shortly after the birth of her first child in 1934. So this is a very dear loss. She was a favorite of her parents, so it was very difficult to overcome that loss. In 1938, Eleanor, his wife, died of heart disease. And then in 1940, Frost's only living son killed himself because he felt like he was also a writer, and felt failure and that kind of stuff. Just a lot of tough stuff. So 2 of his daughters suffered mental breakdowns. His son committed suicide, and Frost himself suffered from depression. Uh, so I think that there's just a lot of tragedy and depression going on in his life. And you look at his works from a different perspective when we get to know the author a little bit more. So, for sure. So we have all these different things going through with him. As I mentioned before, the death of his wife, the loss of children during his lifetime, and just the mental struggles that were going on with his kids and himself. Just were a lot of trouble. But he did get a lot of accolades. Here we have him. Just a few years before he died, with President John F. Kennedy, he was the he basically read a poem at the inauguration of JFK, which was a new thing to happen. We know now that presidents later on have done the same thing, had poets read at their inauguration. Most noted after Robert Frost was Maya Angelou, who just passed away this last year. So Robert Frost was very well known, very famous during his lifetime. He did very well as a poet, and yet suffered a lot of personal tragedy. He was considered a farmer poet, a nature poet. He would say that his work was not about nature. It always had someone in it, a person. So he would say that nature is meant for action. So the poems that he wrote were not just about the nature itself, but how man interacts with nature. And he was very much opposed to the urban-esque type of poetry and lifestyle that was happening during his time period, for sure. So just a little bit about both authors as we get ready for our discussion this week. I think that it definitely helps us to get a new perspective on the writing that we read when we get to know the time period that authors live in, and we get to know the life and influences that writers have. So when you're looking at developing your literary analysis, looking at the works that you are choosing through those perspectives can definitely add depth to your writing and add a new point of view. So I hope that this presentation helps you with the discussion board this week, and also as you continue to think about the literary analysis that you're doing for our next essay. So if you do have any questions, feel free to send them my way. Otherwise, we will see you in the discussion board. Have a great week. Bye.